Hello and welcome to PIF Talks, Pay It Forward Talks at Life Coach University. My name is Maxine Tolbert and it's a pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to talk to you and spend some time together. I really appreciate you being here, and I just want to share my thanks and remind you that in joining today, if you find any benefit from what we are doing and any information that you gather, pay the favor forward. That's all we ask. Just in a manner that is meaningful to you and to value others and share some of the kindness and goodness that we as coaches really invest in, because that's why I'm here today, is to spread the power of coaching and spread the love that comes with that. So that's just my reminder to you, pay it forward. It's important. So again, my name is Maxine Tolbert. I have a business called Expectations Reset, and you'll see a little bit more about where that comes from later in the talk today. But today, I just want to share with you my underlying approach before we get started, because I'm an integrated coaching practice. What can I call it? Yes, integrative coaching. I'm sorry. I consider that when I am coaching an individual or a group of people, that they are each individually three-part systems, and that's mind, brain, and body. They are all interconnected, and any effect in one will immediately affect the other two. So we are constantly in balance, out of balance, depending on what's taking the lead. And often, if you're anything like me, it's our mind that is out of balance with our brain and our body. But sometimes it's our brain actually taking charge, and we have to work very hard for our mind to get back in gear. Anyway, enough of that. What I love to do as a coach is to clarify and demystify some of the things that we go through in our human experience to make our lives a little better. So I use neuroscience and I use neuro-linguistic programming approach, and I use some of my trauma-informed information as well to work with all those three parts. But essentially, when we are coaching, although we can do all of the understanding of who we are and how we are and why, change only comes by moving to action, because that's where the magic is. So I just want to remind you today that if you really want change in your life, you have to move to action. So that aside, let's talk about today's topic. Another thing that I love to do is talking about expectations. Sounds familiar? Today's topic is auditing your expectations with a view of managing your expectations. So why is that topic relevant? Well, we all have expectations, don't we? Some of them are surface level and we're very aware of them, or we can easily bring them to mind when they're not met. But some are not. They reside in our subconscious. We really don't think about them at all. Now, in a previous talk, the last one that I did, and you might want to look that up, I spoke at length about how they become created and how some of those subconscious ones can be deeply embedded in our lives. And I really recommend, if you have the opportunity, to go back to listen to my previous talk about that, because it will add some extra depth of information to what you may learn today. But there's no need, don't rush away. No need to go straight there. You don't need to listen to that before. I have designed these talks so that they don't have to be sequential. So why is it important to manage them? Well, I know as an individual, when you have an unmet expectation, there's discomfort that's associated with that. There's pain, there's an emotion. There's some dissatisfaction, call it what you might. But my go-to saying is that the difference between our expectations and our reality is measured by the level of frustration felt. Your your expectation of something happening is way different to reality, the gap in that middle is frustration, or worse, depending on the nature of the expectation you had and the intensity of the emotion you're feeling. We will come back to that. And if you haven't already figured it out, it is an underpinning reason why I called my business Expectations Reset, because I think as a coach, it's fundamentally part of what we do, and just like the name. So in today's talk, just to prep, I just want to tell you what we're going to do and then we'll do it. So my talk today is going to include the following elements. We're going to talk about raising your awareness of the expectations that you have. And we're going to go through tips on how to do that. Right? Some of them, like I said, are in your conscious thought and are easily brought to mind. But the subconscious ones and the tricky ones, those are the ones that we're going to work to bringing to the surface so that you can work with them, get more information for them. We're going to talk about what is a reasonable expectation and the components of that. Maybe talk about a few examples of what those might be. Then we're going to really do some practice. So we're going to do a reflective exercise, which there is a worksheet for. And I don't know whether you had the opportunity to download that. It is available on my website. So if you would like to go to my website, it's www.expectations-reset.com. And on that website, you'll find a tab called Resources. If you scroll down to the several free resources that are on there, you will find one worksheet that says Audit Your Expectations. That's what we're going to work through today. But if you don't have the opportunity to go there prior or even now to print it out, that's fine. We're going to work through that worksheet and I will take you through every step and we'll talk about each one. So don't worry, don't go anywhere. You are not going to lose out. Okay. And then we're going to talk to moving and managing your expectations. The real move to action, like I said, with the real changes. We're going to talk about that to round out our talk today. So let's get cracking. Okay. Our talk today is an hour long. Please take notes if you desire. If there's anything impactful you immediately want to take away and it helps you to take notes, do so. But I will remind you that this is recorded. So if you would like to fully immerse yourself in listening, I highly recommend that. It's more impactful that way. That's how we love to do coaching. You can go back and watch the replay for anything that stuck out to you that you wanted to pick up on, and you can speed through those, what I call juicy bits. So don't worry about that. And again, that free worksheet is on my website, www.expectationsreset. It's under the resources tab. It's one of my free offers. And the whole purpose of going through this exercise is to do some troubleshooting for yourself. Okay, so this is practical use. So let's talk about the first thing on the agenda, raising your self-awareness around the expectations that you have. It's foundational. Okay. Like I said, identifying your superficial expectations are easy. Like, for example, I expect my kids to pick up their room when I ask them to. It may not happen, but I have an expectation of that. It's a regular one. It's in my conscious thoughts. It's something we do every day. We try, and it's readily available to me thinking about it. But the most troublesome expectations that we have in our lives are often the ones that have a reoccurring nature. And those are the ones that bring up the most negative emotions and impact when they are not met. So, for example, you may find yourself often saying to another person, somebody perhaps who's close to you, you always forget to XYZ, finish the sentence, or you always say that, or you always do something. Those sweeping statements can be hurtful and they're seldom well received. If we're on the receiving end, you know what I'm talking about. Those are the expectations that you have that reside in your subconscious. in the behavioral conditioning and thought conditioning that you have, your paradigm of your life, there's something there that has created an expectation in you because you've had an experience where you believe it's known about. It should be met. No, the should, the necessity, the should. So let's talk about how we need to pull those subconscious things, those expectations that we carry that are more embedded in us and our levels of identity. I talked about that in the last talk. Let's talk about how they need to be brought forward into our consciousness, because unless they're there, we won't handle them. We can't gather insights. We can't learn about them. We can't gather knowledge. So how do we do that? Okay, reflection is key. All right, what do I mean by reflection? Well, in the heat of a moment of any exchange, it's highly unlikely that there's any space for you to think about what's happening or what just happened. In a exchange with another, in an event, in something that's taking place, we're often on automatic pilot, but it's afterwards when it's most important to take the time to recall what happened and think about the exchange. Who did what, factually and when, but also more importantly, the emotional experience that you had associated with that, because that's where the learning is. Because the purpose of learning is to do better next time. So that reflection is a self process which you need to take time for. It's very important if you wish for personal growth and learning about who you are and how you operate, so that you can do better. Because when we know better, we do better. Reflection is number one. So I am going to take you through a process that I refer to as following your emotional marker to gather the insights that we're talking about and to bring things to consciousness that might otherwise not be. So when you find that after an event, something that you had expected to happen didn't, you know you had an emotional response to that. So after, here's what we do. I want you to think about in this reflective process 2 questions. Number 1, what was it that I expected to happen? What did I think should happen? What did I feel ought to have happened? 2 keywords. What did I think should happen? What ought to have happened? Write that down. The next question you ask yourself is, why? What is it about that is important for me? Why was that so important? Something's immediately going to pop up. Write that first thing down. Write it down. Here's what you're going to do. Yeah. You're going to ask that question again. What is so important about that for me? Focus on that word. The one word that you wrote down. What was that? Write that down. Look at that. Really think about that word, that second word that you wrote. Ask yourself that question again. What is it about that word, that's important for me? Now, I know this is repetition, but hear me out. It works. Keep going. Keep asking that question and answering that question over and over to yourself. And every time you come up with an answer, you write it down, write it down. You're drilling down. You're literally drilling down. And the purpose is that you keep going until you have exhausted all of your answers and you were left with one which you can't shift from. There's no further answer to it. You might feel like you're going around in circles on that final answer, but you should come up with one word. One word. It's going to take a while if you're not used to doing this. It may be a little uncomfortable. All of that is good. That means you are bringing something to the surface. It takes effort. That effort is good. So when you have done that, when you've gone through that process, and you're through to completion, you're with one word, keep going until you have it, your answer will identify a value of yours that you hold very dear. That's what we call a core value. It's incredibly important to you. It's fundamental to many things that you operate around in your life. So let me give you an example. One of mine, respect. Often when an expectation is not met, we can feel that disrespected. It's respect that we are looking for. Respect of XYZ, whatever it is. It's personal respect, respect of a property, whatever. Respect is the value. So I'm just using that as an example. That's my word. That may not be yours. But you must go until you get one word. Now you have enough information to work with to do a better job. So what are you going to do with that word, right? The whole purpose of this exercise is to approach your expectation differently, do differently, have a better outcome. So once you have that word, now you can name the emotion that you felt that was associated with that word, right? You've labeled your value, you know your pain point, and you have your emotional marker. That's why I call that process this. The next step is for you to properly name the emotion that you felt. Emotional granularity is key here. If you can achieve it, it just provides you more information about the emotion that you felt and the level of intensity that you felt. And in doing that, it will address, actually lower the power that emotion had over you. So I'm going to introduce something you may or may not already know about, but it's called the emotion wheel, or the emotions wheel. And I'm going to just show you a picture of one example. You can see that there's a core right in the middle there. Let's see if I can get into the middle here. Of the key fundamental emotions. I'm going to read them out. Excuse me while I get my glasses. But you've got feeling sad, feeling angry, feeling disgusted, fearful, generally bad, and surprised, which was a surprise to me that that's a very intense feeling. But on the outside of that, you've got some derivatives of each of those, and they're followed by the color, so you can see them. And I'm not really intending to show you the words on here. I'm just showing you the expansion of the emotions that we can feel, from very intense to less intense to even less intense. And it's important for this granularity, your emotional knowledge, to actually properly name and identify the emotion that you felt, because you can see immediately from this wheel that the further away from the center it is, the less power, less impactful really and intense that emotion is. So by naming that emotion, you truly get to understand what you felt, but more importantly, why? Because you've associated it with a value. That's key. That connection, this following the process, your emotional marker is key. So I'm going to give you an example. We all tend to default to using some of the very basic emotions, and it's been, I believe, proven in many studies that if you ask people to name the key emotions they live with every day, they could probably only name 3 or 4, maybe 5. But one of the big ones, and often the default word that people use, is angry. So think about the expectation, think about the emotion. Do you really mean pure anger? Was that what you really felt, or was it something else? So example, a derivative of anger, and you can find this wheel anywhere on the internet by just Googling or using the browser, wherever you wish, for emotions wheel. Loads of free PDF copies. It's a go-to for me. Anyway, I digress. So where were we? Anger. What are derivatives of anger? Did you really feel purely anger, or was it something else? Was it further out on that wheel? Did you just feel let down? Did you feel humiliated? Were you frustrated? Remember the difference between your reality and your expectation is the frustration you feel. Was it just frustration? Were you mad? Did it make you feel aggressive? Those are further out from the intense feeling of angry. Or was it even further out on the emotional wheel? Did you feel betrayed? Did you feel jealous? Were you resentful? Were you just annoyed? You see, by further going out and giving some granular description to that emotion, it allows you to put some rationale, some reasonableness around it. You know the value, you know the emotional feeling that's associated with that value now. So at this point, I believe if you follow that process on something, anything actually, not even just an expectation, but at this point, once you've added some emotional granularity and the value and you've put them together, you are already feeling better about what happened. You are feeling much more in control, you're getting that back, of understanding why. And now that emotion isn't controlling you. Okay, that's key. So that's how you bring it to your conscious thought. It's an exercise. It takes a little practice. The more you do it, the speedier it will become, and it will become automatic nature. But it takes the reflective thought. It takes you going through this process. It takes time, and you have to make time for that reflection. Okay. Once you have gathered that knowledge, you can now put that knowledge into practice. So the trick is here that when you have such an emotion, if you can just purely recognize it when it comes up, you're going to know the value that is being challenged. And you're going to know that that's a pain point for you. It's all there in your conscious thought. And you're going to know the emotion that is arising or about to may already be there. But that forward thought, that understanding of self, gives you time because you feel it coming, you recognize, you know what's going on. And now you have more to work with to do it differently, it being your reaction. The transaction that you're about to have, the thing that you're going to say, how you're feeling about the whole expectation not being met. You have a choice. You've increased your choices to do something differently. And congratulations. I seriously mean that. If you can actually get to that point, you have taken the first step in shifting some of the things that are limiting you from doing and feeling better. That means your thoughts, your behaviors, your actions. Those are all self-limiters, and you've increased your self-awareness. Yay. Now, in another time, I'm just going to put a placeholder here because there's so much more we could talk about. In my next talk, I plan to talk about the practice of creating that gap between your emotion, the event, the emotion you feel, and then your reaction. Awareness of that gap, building the gap. It's a practice. And I'd love to do a separate talk on that. So I'm going to put that as a placeholder and entice you to come and listen again to how you can actually practice the gap. So let's move on to the next subject that I said that we would introduce in this talk. And this is, what is a reasonable expectation? So, you know me, I love to go to the definitions. So I kind of pulled this together based on several sources like I do, just to make it nice and quick and easy for you to think about it. A reasonable expectation is one that has good grounds for you to think it will or ought to be done. It will or ought to be met, right? So let's pick that definition apart. It's short, but there's some subjective words in there, right? Think. That's personal. That's all about you. That's your mind. Woohoo! It's deep. And ought. Well, that is presupposed on something is constructually expected, ought. So that is environmentally driven often. It is organizationally driven often. It is built in around your context and your environment, right? So the think of the ought is based on a presupposition or an assumption. Ugh. There's some depth there, right? That's wholly subjective. So let's break it down. What are the essential elements of a reasonable expectation? The reason I'm going at this talk this way is that once you consider what those elements are, you can start looking to see if those elements exist in the expectations that you are recognizing you have. So let's walk down them. All right. What would make it reasonable? Number one, knowledge or evidence to support the outcome would be met. The knowledge should be factually based. Evidence. Evidence is it's happened before. You have reasonable evidence that this is typical and has and will have happened before, and therefore it's reasonable to rely on the fact that it should happen again, right? You've got evidence. You've got prior evidence, right? So you've got knowledge or evidence. Number one, check. Write that down. Agreement is the next one. In an expectational transaction, there's always yourself, usually, and another person or body organization. It's between two parties. Whatever the other party is, it's a party. There's two parties. There should be agreement between two that that outcome is reasonable. It can be expected. You've agreed that that is an outcome that both of you will have. Now, that can be verbal. You've spoken it to each other, expressed it to each other, or it can be implied. Now, an implied one would be kind of like a social construct. When you're crossing the road, for example, you live in America, I come from Europe, so this doesn't apply in England, but you are expecting cars to be driving on the right-hand side of the road. So when you are crossing the road, you are going to look both ways based on the direction you know the car is coming. That's an implied expectation, right? That's an implied agreement. It's a social construct that in America, people drive on the right. There's an agreement there. It's a reliable agreement. You have knowledge, you have evidence, right? Just to take that back up the line. So that's number two. So first, knowledge and evidence to support it. Two, you have agreement between the two parties. Number three, this is where we often slip up. There's communication between the parties of the preferences that each party has, right? The other party knows, but also knows about its importance, the outcome being met, the outcome being met, and its significance. It's been communicated between two parties. It's very important to know. And it's important because, and it's significant because, right? Communication. You know where I'm going with that. Last but not least, consideration. Another one where we might neglect to think about. Whose best interests are being served when this outcome is expected? See why we often miss that one? You have to consider why if the best interests are yours in this outcome, you have to consider why your interests rank higher than the other parties. Because 9 times out of 10, it's human nature to fulfill our own self-interest first, unless we have a relationship status between the two parties. That means that we might love somebody, care enough for somebody to put their needs ahead of ours in certain circumstances, right? So you've got to look at the consideration, which is going to be depend on whose best interests are being served. Going to be dependent on your relationship status between the two parties, but also the environmental context, the ecology per se, right? What's going on in context? What is the scenario that you're talking about? And in that scenario, whose best interests are being served? Is it reasonable to believe that your interests rank higher than the other person's? Deep, right? We often don't think about that. We are, as humans, rather self-centered that way. Not everybody and not all the time. No judgment call here. But when we want something, we want something, right? Think of a child. When they want something, they want something. They're serving their self-interest, and their second thought is seldom anybody else. They want what they want. So let's just put it into context. So now you know all of those components. Let's move on to auditing your own expectations. So this is where I'm going to ask you to bring up that reflective exercise worksheet, because I think it's a great way of, by doing a practical exercise together, to better demonstrate how you can audit your expectations to not only see if they're reasonable, but the real purpose behind it is to give you more insight on how you might form your expectations going forward so that they are reasonable and the desired outcome that you wish can be met. That's really the purpose of this whole talk and auditing it. Because once you know better, you can do better and you will feel better. So again, I'm just going to remind you of that saying, and I really do speak to this myself every day. It's a great grounding thought for me, so I bring it often. The difference between our expectations and our reality is measured by the amount of frustration we feel. Wow. So let's go through this worksheet. So I'm going to show you just really basically what it looks like. Don't worry. But I just want to show you because it's really a fillable worksheet. All right. And it's got several blocks, and we're going to work down each one of these. And you can see here at the top that we have, you know, you pick an example of an expectation you have. So the best use of this really is to reflect very quickly, if you can, if you have a moment, about a visceral emotion that you felt in a recent event where you had an expectation that was unmet by another person or another body. You really, really had an outcome that was very significant and important to you. You've recognized that there was a core value beneath it, and it's important for you to have had this expectation met. But now if you go through this exercise, you're going to be able to determine whether it was reasonable for you to be upset that it wasn't. Because if the components of a reasonable expectation weren't there, then your emotional reaction is perhaps unreasonable, and you may be able to see it differently. So shift of perspective, shift of action later, learning lesson. So we are going to walk down this exercise. So the first part of this is firstly to name what your expectation was. Write it out. Just what did you expect to happen? No whys. What was your expectation? Next, underneath that, you're going to write the entity that you felt should have fulfilled it. Who did you expect to complete that outcome for you? Who was owing that outcome to you? Somebody was going to do something. There was an action there on behalf of somebody else. Who was that entity? Now, it could be a singular person, could be a group of people, could be a social organization, could be, I'm going to go for the big one, right? The government. Okay. Write that down. we went through the exercise of following your emotional marker. Write down, we've given you that reflective process. What emotion did you feel when that expectation wasn't met? Remember, granularity is key here. I've introduced this emotion wheel. Highly recommend that if your emotional language and ability to really define in many words your emotions felt is a little lacking, this is a wonderful tool. I use it, and I would love more people to do it. There's no shame in it. You're growing, you're learning. You'll get it. Print it out. Stick it up on your wall. That's where mine resides. So name the emotion, granular emotion, write it. So the next step, and forgive me while I grab my glasses here because it's an age thing. Look at the details now that we're going to examine where your on which your expectation was founded. Right. So this is the first box, and if you don't have the worksheet, that's fine. I'm going to read it out. Maybe you can jot it down, or don't jot it down, but just put the answer. Again, this is recorded. You can come back to this, but let's walk through this together. So first of all, remember the components. What knowledge or evidence did you have that supported your expected outcome would be fulfilled? Now, I'm talking about facts and evidence here. I'm not talking about what you felt, what you shoulds and the could and all of that. We're taking you out. Let's be factual here. Knowledge. What knowledge did you have? What evidence did you have? Evidence that it's reasonable to me expect this because this is what has always happened. My family always does this. My whomever. What is the evidence that supports your expectation be reasonable? Write it down. Jot it down. You may have quite a solid foundation here, or you may not. Doesn't matter. Write it down. Now we're going to look at the next component that is equally important. So if your outcome was not spoken to the other party, you hadn't specifically said it, this is what I expect, what implied agreement might have existed between you and the other party that where you should expect this outcome? So I use, for example, me crossing the road. I expect traffic to be coming from a certain direction when I cross the road, so I'm going to look certain ways. And it's an implied agreement that you're going to be driving on a certain side of the road, so I can expect to be able to cross the road in that manner safely. Basic, right? And I'm using that because there's no emotion involved in it. Oh, obviously, unless somebody's driving on the right side of the road, you get hit. But that's all, don't think. So if the agreement was not spoken, what implied agreement exists? You may not have one. That's fine. Do you have a spoken one? Write that down. What is your logic behind that implied agreement? Why was it implied? Without having to be spoken, why was it implied? I explained to you that it's a social construct in America to be driving on the right-hand side of the road. That is the rationale and the logic behind my expectation of crossing the road safely. Just using that as an example. So what's your rationale? What's your logic behind that this was an implied agreement? Let's use another example to see if this will help. Our weekly trash is picked up on a Tuesday and a Friday every week. So I know that I need to put our trash can out. Listen to me use all these American words. On the street every Tuesday early in the morning and every Friday early in the morning. I expect them to come and do that. I don't necessarily have a contract that says that, but there is a service announcement on the website for the utility company that states for our location, that is what they like to do for our area, Tuesdays and Fridays. It's written. However, I also know that when holidays come around that fall on, say, Friday, that the trash will not be picked up that day. It doesn't say it anywhere. It's kind of implied that it will not be picked up that day, and often we'll be told when it will be. It may be skipped completely, but it's implied, and I know it because I have evidence that this always happens. I also look around my neighborhood and know nobody else has put their trash out for that day because it's a holiday. I know these are very simple things, but I'm trying to use ones where they're reasonable and I can explain to you a little bit more about the logic behind them without me or my emotions getting in the way. As you're working down this worksheet, there may be quite a few emotions associated with the expectations that you are living with that have gone unmet and the one that you're working on this worksheet. So I'm acknowledging that. I'm just trying to do it from a different angle here. So that's number one, knowledge or evidence. It was an implied agreement and what's your rationale behind it. The next one, communication. That nice little word that often we forget to do is communicate our needs and wants and desires. Communicate to the other party. Did you communicate what your preferred outcome was to the person or entity that was meant to fulfill it? Let's use a personal example. I'll use me. I've become to expect my husband to make me a coffee in the morning. There's a little love language thing. I've become to expect it. Have I communicated that? No. This is something that he has chosen to do, and I've become to expect it because there's evidence and knowledge there. It's kind of an implied agreement, but there's no communication there about it. But there's a certain way that I kind of like my coffee. I have a preference of how I want my coffee, and we get there. But have I communicated what my preferences are of the outcome? Write it down. Over to the next page of the worksheet. So we're now at the top, page 2. In that communication, have you communicated and explained to the other party the importance and significance that their outcome holds for you? I like my coffee black. I like it hot, nothing in it. I can't drink it any other way. We get old, we get set in our ways, right? It's just me. That's how I prefer my coffee. It's important to me. I have 1 cup of coffee a day, 1 caffeinated coffee a day. I treasure it. And my husband knows that. That's why it's in the love language. I've communicated its importance and significance to me. And he fulfills that for me. And I've become to expect that. And it's reasonable to expect that. I have fulfilled the requirements of a reasonable expectation there in explaining the importance and significance of how I like my coffee to the other party. Does that make sense? I'm just using it as an example so that you can think through as you write yours down when you're going through your specific example. Did you explain the importance and significance to the other party? We often forget to do that. We kind of go into that they should know. Well, it's not reasonable to expect other people to be mind readers. If we haven't communicated it in any way in the past or currently, they will often trip up on that. It's not reasonable if we've not communicated it. Here's the next big one. And this is one that I hadn't wholly thought about before. when I was going through some of this auditing my own expectations and came up with this worksheet. Whose best interests are being served when the outcome is met? Now, usually when we have an expectation, it's our own self-interests that are being served. You have a want, a need, a desire, and you're expecting it. But that serves your self-interest. And you are expecting the other entity to perhaps forgo their own self-interest to fulfill yours. Not entirely, it may not be a big one, but that's what you're doing. Whose self-interests are being served? Because when you identify whose self-interest is being served, you get a little bit more information about why your outcome, what you want to happen, is not happening. Because you may be asking a little too much of the other entity. It's our human nature to serve our own best interests first. Not always, but there are key components which will dictate how we choose to serve best interests, right? So once you've identified whose best interests are being served in the outcome, then you can go down to them and pull that in here. Fill in the next one. This is the crux of sometimes why our expectations don't get met. Why is it reasonable for you to assume they should have served your interests and not their own? Why is that reasonable? So again, I think you remember earlier, I kind of referenced there's two components there as to what they would think about. It's really about the relationship that is between you and the other party and the context environment within which the scenario of the fulfillment is taking place. So let's look at that first one. Your relationship with that other entity and the depth and breadth of that, and this type of relationship is going to significantly influence or even dictate whether your outcome is going to be met, whether they are willing to serve your best interests than their own. We all have boundaries, we all have barriers, we all have other pulls on our time. And it's important for you to recognize whether the relationship you have with the other party is significant for them to have done the reverse and serve your needs first. Because that's reasonable, isn't it? So a loved one may happily bring you a coffee every morning and not think twice about it and make your coffee first and theirs second. But a visitor to your house would have no knowledge about that and wouldn't even probably consider it. And why should they? So just to use a bland example. The other component of that, well, what's the context? What's the ecology? What's the environment in which this is happening? Is it reasonable for me when being at a hotel that my husband gets up first and goes and gets me a coffee from down in the lobby? It's serving my best interests over his, because I get to remain in bed while he goes down to the lobby, has to get dressed and do whatever to bring that coffee back. But is that reasonable of me to expect it? Not really. Not at all. Why wouldn't I do that for him? But it's important for me to know the context there and then appreciate that expectation being met if indeed it is, and not to be upset if it isn't. So you see where we're going with that. So once you've been all through of those, last one on here. Is it reasonable for the other party to be assumed to know what you want. That's the end question on the bottom of that worksheet. Is it reasonable that you think that person should have known what you want based on the evidence, facts, interest? Are you being reasonable here? Because now you have the answers. Now you've filled all this sheet and you know whether that was a reasonable ask or not, well, verbal or implied, right? Now you've gone through that. Part of this worksheet is to look and say, so how do you feel now about that expectation not being met? What is your level of ownership in that? What did you not do in those components of the essential elements of a reasonable expectation? What was missing? Okay. And now I've identified perhaps something that wasn't there, that needed to be. How does it make you feel now about having that expectation unmet? Write that down. This is a process journey, right? Write that down. Solidify and anchor how differently you feel about that, if indeed you do. You may have found that this was a completely reasonable expectation, but you're still going to have an emotional outcome. It actually could be stronger, but write it down, right? This is a process. I hope that going through that auditing process, and you can do this for every expectation that you have, could be painful. I would also suggest doing the significant ones. You see the process of thought here, the reflective approach to logically walk your way down a system of bringing in more information, bringing more insight, acquiring more insight and clarity in order for you to be able to learn from it and then move to action to do differently. So that's what we're going to talk about next, is then moving forward to action. So you're looking at that scenario and you know now that you would prefer to feel differently. You may already do so, but how would you prefer to feel? Right? This solidifies and anchors what you're going to do going forward just based on that expectation. How do you prefer to feel? What or how could you have approached this differently to get a better outcome for yourself? What are you going to, next time, what are you going to do to actually complete and fulfill the components of a reasonable expectation? What could you have done? How could you have done something differently to get that outcome there? Do you see any other possible outcomes? Right? If you had done X, what could have been the outcomes from that? Think about it. You're owning this. How do you feel about those alternatives? Those alternative outcomes that could happen? Are you okay with them? Could it be slightly different and you'd still feel okay? Would your value be met? Would your emotion be lesser? Would it be a nicer outcome, a more comfortable outcome, and not a negative emotion felt? And now how can you move forward to get more preferred outcomes in general, right? Here's the biggie. When are you going to start doing that? When are you actually going to put this into action? It's one of the reasons I put this worksheet in there, because once you actually take action to audit your own expectations, you're already moving forward to action because it's organic. Once you know better, once you get more insight, more information and clarity, all of that provides you more information for you to know different and act different. But now you have to make the choice to do different. What are you going to do about that? One of my favorite terms. Now you know more. What are you going to do about that? Next question on here. When? Make a decision. When are you going to start doing something different on that to manage your expectations, to do it differently so that your emotional outcome from unmet expectations is less, or you even get rid of it completely? Because when an expectation is reasonable, there's really no negative outcome, is there? Think about that. We all have expectations. You can't get rid of them. I love that people out there say, oh, you know, an expectation is just, you know, setting yourself up for failure. No, it's reasonable to have expectations when they're communicated and formed well. Okay. So being accountable, set a time, go through some expectations you have, work this worksheet. It's on my website, www.expectations-reset.com. I really would invite you to go through this. And the whole purpose of it is it's going to help you manage your expectations and organically manage your emotions felt. You will automatically and organically reduce the negative emotions that you feel. You're going to ensure better outcomes for all parties involved. You will be perceived as a much more diplomatic and easier person to work with in order for things to get done. And who doesn't want that? So we're coming to the end of our talk, and we are at the Q&A session. Unfortunately, I guess I've over-talked again and really don't have time for that. But please just let me know if you have any Q&As. Put them either in the chat here so I can address them later, or send them to me after. My email is maxine@expectations-reset.com, and I will get back with you with the answer. And yeah, happy to kind of do that outside this talk. So again, my name is Maxine Tolbert. I'm Expectations Reset CEO. I'm a coach and life mindset and success coach, and I practice NLP as well. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you today on Life Coach University. Again, this is a pay it forward talk, and I remind you that if you found value in any way from this talk today, that you pay this generosity in a form that you can and is appropriate to you to another person, another group of people, to spread the kindness and the love that comes from coaching, and something that we here at Life Coach University believe in wholeheartedly as humans. And I look forward to talking to you another time and speaking about more topics. So watch this space, and I will say goodbye. Thank you.